Here's something that might surprise you. You don't need to dominate a meeting to be visible. You don't need a complete, brilliant idea or an original plan. And you don't need to be the loudest voice in the room. What you do need are repeatable ways to enter the conversation, structure a contribution, and land it clearly. And that's the difference between speaking just to speak and making your presence felt. A lot of quiet professionals wait for the perfect opening. And unfortunately, meetings rarely give you this open invitation that just says, come to the floor and contribute, right? So you have to recognize an opening or you need to create one. So in this video, I'm going to show you 5 ways to speak up at work that feels natural, useful, and grounded in how you already communicate. One of the reasons speaking up actually feels so difficult is that people make the job much bigger than it actually needs to be. So they believe that they need a completely polished explanation or the most original insight, or that an answer that resolves the entire discussion. And we all know that is rarely the case, right? So that creates really this unnecessary amount of pressure before we have even opened our mouths to contribute. But effective participation can look like many different things. You can ask a question that brings clarity. You can connect 2 ideas that have been discussed separately. And you can identify a risk or summarize the conversation or even offer a recommendation that's going to move the group one step forward. And those are all really meaningful contributions. So the goal is not to talk constantly, and the goal is to contribute in a way that helps the room think, decide, or move. So the first way to make speaking up feel more natural is to stop asking yourself, what brilliant thing should I be saying right now? The question is actually far too broad and abstract and ineffective. So instead, what you want to ask yourself is, what kind of contribution would help right now? So there are several valid speaking roles that you can take on in a meeting. You can add information, you can ask for clarification, you can connect 2 ideas, you can identify a risk, you can disagree with the direction, you can summarize what's been discussed, or you can make a recommendation. And this actually reduces the pressure to have to think about this brand new idea every single time that you speak. So for example, perhaps the conversation is actually moving too quickly, that no one has had any time to clarify who owns a decision or an action. So your contribution doesn't need to be like a full monologue, and all it has to do is ask to clarify. So can we clarify who has final decision authority here? Or who in this room is going to take on this action? I believe this was missed in the discussion. And maybe the room has been discussing 3 different issues all at once, and you can summarize. So it sounds as though we are dealing with a capacity issue, a timeline issue, and an ownership issue. Which one do we need to resolve first? Or perhaps everyone agrees with the direction, but no one has actually named the risk that is involved. Then you can say, one concern I want to flag is how this approval process could affect the timeline. So each of these contributions will help the room move forward. Before your next meeting, just choose one role you're willing to take. Ask, add, clarify, connect, summarize, or recommend. So giving yourself one clear job will make participation feel much more manageable than walking in with the vague intention to just speak up more. Once you know what kind of contribution you want to make, you need a simple way to structure it. The framework I recommend is listen, link, and land. So first, listen for the current thread. What is the group discussing? What seems unclear? What's missing? And where is this conversation starting to repeat itself? Then link your contribution to what has already been said. So this is helpful because you aren't forcing a completely new topic here. You're just showing that you have been listening and that your point actually connects to the work already underway. So you might begin with building on that. Another angle to consider is that connects to something we're seeing on our team. I want to build on the concern about capacity. I think the larger risk here is the approval process. My recommendation is that we confirm the decision maker before committing to the date. And that contribution works really well because it's connected, it's relevant, and complete. So the listener can tell you what you're responding to, what your point is, and what you think should happen next. The important part is to stop once you have landed it. A lot of thoughtful professionals make a strong point and then add 3 bonus endings because the silence just feels so awkward. They explain it again, and they soften it, and then they add a disclaimer. So remember, you don't need to keep talking until every possible misunderstanding has been eliminated. Make the point, land it clearly, and allow the room to respond. Learn to be uncomfortable in silence. If having language ready would make this easier for you, download my free resource, 7 Scripts for Leadership Presence. It gives you practical ways to enter conversations, share recommendations, clarify decisions, and also speak with more authority without having to build every sentence from scratch while you're under pressure. So you'll find the link below. And keep watching because the next strategy is going to help you enter the conversation before you start overthinking. Now, use a doorway sentence. A doorway sentence tells the room what kind of contribution is coming. It gives you a clean way into the discussion, and it gives the listeners a really clear reason to stay with you. To add information, you might say, I'll add 1 data point that may help is. There's 1 additional factor we should consider. To clarify, you might say, can I check my understanding? What decision are we trying to make today? Before we move on, can we clarify one thing? To disagree, you might say, I see this thing slightly differently. I agree with the objective and I have a concern about the approach. I want to offer another perspective before we decide. To synthesize, you might say, the pattern I'm hearing is, it sounds as though we have 2 options. What I'm taking from this discussion is, so the doorway sentence reduces the pressure of figuring out how to begin. You already know the first few words, so your brain can focus on the actual contribution instead of trying to create like a really polished introduction every single time. It also helps you sound more intentional. So compare these sentences. Sorry, this may not make sense, but I was just kind of wondering if maybe this timeline could be a problem. With this, I have 1 concern about the timeline. The second version doesn't sound aggressive. It sounds clear. And a lot of people weaken their contributions even before anyone has heard it. And then they apologize. They feel like they have to qualify or signal uncertainty because they are trying to protect themselves from disagreement. Unnecessary disclaimers actually encourage the listeners to discount the point before you've even made it. Respectful directness actually gives your idea a fair chance to land. And once you have finished, you can use a closing doorway as well. So this is the main point for me. I'll pause there. My recommendation is that we confirm ownership before moving ahead. So a clear finish is part of a clear contribution. You can also use a question. So a strong question can reveal assumptions, clarify a decision, redirect a vague conversation, or help the group see a risk that hasn't been considered before. So some of the most useful questions in a meeting are, what outcome are we optimizing for? What evidence would change our decision? Who owns the next step? What risk are we accepting if we move forward? What would success look like 3 months from now? Are we solving the immediate issue or the underlying one? These questions actually demonstrate your judgment. They show that you're thinking beyond the task and considering the quality of the decision as well. So they're going to give you a natural way to contribute when you don't have yet a complete recommendation. So perhaps you're still forming your view, but you can already see that the group is using a different definition of success. And asking the right question can improve the entire discussion. So this is also where active listening can become really visible for you. When you paraphrase what you've heard and ask a question that helps someone explain their reasoning, you're doing more than participating. You're shaping the conversation. So for example, it sounds as though speed is the priority, but we're also concerned about adoption. How are we weighing these 2 options? And that question shows that you listened, identified the tension, and also helped the group address it directly. So you didn't need to dominate the room. You brought the room 1 useful step forward. And speaking up naturally also means knowing what to do when the conversation doesn't go perfectly. So you may be interrupted. Someone may jump in before you even finish, and your idea may reappear 10 minutes later. And quiet professionals often treat that moment as like a signal to retreat. and they assume that the opening has closed and they let the conversation move on. But you can re-enter really calmly. So if someone interrupts you, you can say, I'd like to finish that point, or let me complete that thought because the implication matters here. I'll come to that in a moment. I want to finish this recommendation first. So those sentences are really direct without being really dramatic about it. And if your idea reappears without attribution, you can say, yes, that connects to the recommendation that I raised earlier. I'd like to build on it. Or, that's the same direction I was proposing. One additional point I would add is, and you're not judging others for taking your ownership. You're really just simply reconnecting yourself to the idea and keeping your contribution visible. Allies can help with this as well. So a colleague can return the floor back to you after an interruption. So I'd like to hear Josephine finish her point, please. Or they can reinforce your contribution. That connects to what Josephine raised earlier. And they can ask a follow-up question that gives you the room to expand. So healthy visibility doesn't always have to be built alone. Part of leadership is really creating meeting cultures where useful contributions are heard, credited, and explored. So before your next meeting, write down one objective. So what do you want your contribution to accomplish? Maybe you want to clarify a decision. Maybe you want to connect the business discussion to a business outcome. And maybe you want to name a risk that has been overlooked. Then prepare 2 doorway phrases you can use. For example, building on that, I have one concern about. Next, identify one agenda item where your expertise is going to be relevant. So don't wait until the final 5 minutes. Aim to contribute within the first third of the meeting while the conversation is still open and your mind hasn't had enough time to actually turn one useful thought into this whole internal narrative that brings you down. So when you speak, use listen, link, and land. And after the meeting, record, what did I say? What effect did I have? And what would I refine next time? All you're doing when you're reflecting is collecting evidence for participation, usefulness, and your growth. And this is how speaking up will become more natural. You stop treating every contribution like it's going to be a self-evaluation, and you start treating it like it's a skill that you're actively working towards. You don't need to be dominating meetings to be visible. You don't need the complete solution or the fastest response or the biggest personality to be visible as well. You need a repeatable way to enter the conversation, structure your thought, and finish your point clearly. Decide what kind of contribution is needed. So use listen, link, land. Begin with a doorway sentence. Ask questions that's going to improve the quality of the discussion, and learn how to re-enter when the conversation doesn't unfold perfectly. So visibility is built through concise, relevant contributions that are made over time and consistently over time. So you don't wait until you have that complete answer. Just bring the room one useful step forward. Download my 7 scripts for leadership presence below if you want language that's going to make that easier for you. And watch the next video where I'll show you how introverts can build meaningful professional relationships without networking in a way that feels phony or transactional.